Let's turn now to the opening stave of Christmas Carol and go a bit further into the character of Scrooge as it's revealed there. So we can see the context, the sort of before picture, before the transformation. So, as we know, Scrooge is one of the most famous characters in English literature, and very few people will not understand a reference to Scrooge, which immediately connotes the idea of a miserly, grumpy old skinflint, penny pincher. And Dickens builds up that creation, and the earliest indication of that aspect is revealed in the first part of the story, where he won't even heat his own home, though he runs his business, he's capable of doing so. And when he gets to this place of business, the same ideas reinforced. He refuses to allow his employee, Bob Cratchit, any extra coal to increase the heat in the office. So it's like that picture we saw in the last session of he carries cold with him. So I just want to go further into the context of that. And we're given this character in a masterful portrait, pen portrait, without revealing the reason. How has he got to be where he is now? The only hint will come later as we look back into his past and into his present, into his visits with the Ghost of Christmas Past and Ghost of Christmas Present. He's depicted as extremely cold, callous businessman. And we've looked at this passage, cold-hearted and miserly. Here's the famous passage. And his character is synonymous with his environment, and his features highlight this miserable, unfriendly demeanor. He's bitter and he's callous. The people on the streets avoid him. Even the dogs, even the animals purposely avoid Scrooge, don't make eye contact with him. So he's a picture of that, being greedy and solitary. He in his interactions with Bob Cratchit and with his nephew's offer to celebrate Christmas, and with the two guys who come to the door asking for charitable donations, he's unfriendly. And all of this is established time and time again. It's like painting layers on a character so that the ultimate transformation is seen as even more remarkable. And our task is to say what made the change, what made the metanoia between this picture and the one that we get in the last part of the story. So the opening stave sets the mood, describes the setting, and introduces many of the principal characters. And it is extremely allegorical, a type of narrative where the characters and the events represent particular ideas or themes. And in this case, Scrooge represents greed and apathy and everything that stands against generosity and kindness and what Dickens calls the Christmas spirit. And Bob Cratchit personifies those who are suffering under the Scrooges of the world. And this is Dickens' point, the English poor. And Fred serves to remind readers of the possibilities of joy and cheer. His nephew, he's not extremely well off, but he manages to manifest a pleasantness, kindness, and friendliness, and open-hearted hospitality. And there's another side which there is a kind of Gothic element to a lot of Dickens' writing, and he blends wild comedy. Even in these characterizations, there's a comedic element to it, but there's this wild comedy with an atmospheric horror. You think of when he's at the end of the visit with Marley, and he sees a throng of spirits drifting through the fog just outside his window. And there's a relatively simplistic symbolism and a linear plot, and the plot is divided into 5 staves, and each has an episode in Scrooge's spiritual re-education. And the first stave centers on the visitation from Marley's ghost, and then Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future. And that's significant to contemplate at this point, because metanoia, a change of mind and purpose, has to do with your present, your future, your past, your present, and your future, and a way of understanding time itself. But we'll get to that. So the three middle staves present the tales of the three Christmas spirits, and the last concludes the story, just showing the extent of the transformation from inflexible curmudgeon to a warm and joyful benefactor. And underlying all this narrative is the theme of moral redemption. But deeper than that, wider than that, is a perspective on the present social and political situation. And Dickens is taking aims at the poor laws, which then would govern the underclass of Victorian England. Dickens was kind of between the times. He sort of predates Victorian England, but he rails against the things that we presently would call Victorian. So it's very much at the early stages of Victoria's reign, but he's exposing the flaws of an unfair system of government that is essentially restricts the underclass to a life in prison or a life in the workhouse. And don't forget that Dickens' own father was in prison for debt when Dickens was only 12. And so Dickens has a very sympathetic portrayal of Bob Cratchit and his family, and that puts a human face on the suffering that such people would go through. And they, of course, were not even in the worst place. And Dickens, or Scrooge rather, defends the poor laws. He says the prisons are the only charity that he would care to support. And Dickens is going to dismiss the excuses of the indifferent upper class as an irresponsible and selfish and a cruel defense. He's saying this transformation is necessary. And listen, it's necessary not just on an individual level, but on a social level. There's a micro picture and a macro picture. But the two run together, of course. And this is a symbol, a parable, an allegory of what happens when one man goes through his process of metanoia. So let's close there. And in the next session, we'll just consider more deeply what metanoia really is. Okay.